Okay, let's go. So hey guys, so welcome to the stream. Oh, I'm a member. And also, you might be wondering, Shark Boy, why are you in Technoblade skin? Well, listen, look. So I did play on this. I played on the server a little bit, and actually I did play on this server a little bit, and every time I was in my usual skin, the shield wasn't showing, or should I say, the shield was a little lower down. So I switched to this skin so I would be able to see the shield. Well, one thing Mojang could have added was like a offhand inventory box, so you could be able to see the shield and how long and its cooldown when the shield gets hit by an axe. So yeah. Anyways, let's join. Oh, never mind. Alright. No. Duels. Okay. And also, y'all already know I got a new microphone, so y'all should be able to hear me a lot more easily. Alright. This time we're gonna do axe. 1v1. See, now I can finally see the shield. But it's a little more frustrating that I have to use shift to carry the shield. Okay, I'm messing up. Alright, first victory. GG's. Alright. So yeah, that was my first victory, and as y'all can see, I already had goes on this on the left, on the right side of my screen. So yeah, 63 deaths. Yeah, I really suck at PvP. Anyways, if you guys, this is Flamefrax server, who is a really good Minecraft PvPer. If you want to join this server, then the server IP is in the link is in the description, and also the port for any Bedrock players. Because I don't think for Java players you don't need a port to join. Alright, I'm going again. There you go. Sometimes it also takes ages to load. That doesn't matter. My skin. But here I am. Excuse me. Alright. Wins, I got 77. I got 75 kills. My deaths is 63. Oh, my playtime is... Okay, never mind. Okay, it's lagging. Gosh. I'm gonna die. Never mind. To be fair, that was actually pretty close. Alright. Okay, that was the longest fight ever. GG's. Oh my god. Maybe we could try another kit in the next stream. Yeah. I'm also starting to get a little better. I fell in the water. I'm also starting to get a little better at using the shield more. But still, Mojang should add in that option inventory box so you could see the shield and its cooldown when it gets hit by an axe. Okay, I messed up. Okay. Nice crit. Okay, nice crit. Alright, GG's. Oh, I just realized I'm on a streak right now. It's 5. I'm gonna go again. And also guys, I was trying to look for a server like the one Dream trained in for Axe PvP, and I thought CubeCraft, but I was like, nah, that didn't include the other kits. So one day I was just watching YouTube until I found Flame Frax's server. So I checked it out and I was like, yo, this is just like PvP Legacy. So this is a perfect place to train in.
Text-to-speech enabled.
Okay.
Skull and Crossbones. Pancacus Rule was killed by Twitch Ghosty with 8.5 health. Skull and Crossbones. Bell 77,386,546 was killed by Baron Zeal with 8.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Jalen 2025 was killed by Tower Gaboom 92 with 8.6 health. Skull and Crossbones. Vacploi was killed by Donny 0822 with 12.7 health. Donny 0822s. Baron Zeal GG. Vacploi Watt. Skull and Crossbones. Kai Olaf was killed by 4. Skull and Crossbones. Vexen YT someone join car. Gojira Go Sword 2v2. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. King Sunsets was killed by Avora Bet with 13.6 health. Skull and Crossbones. Wood Crew 1 was killed by CNS 258 with 20.0 health. King Sunsets GG. CNS 258 GG. Skull and Crossbones. Bell 77,300. Skull and Crossbones. Abdel 30 was killed by
Used to using the sword.
King Elias joined net.
Click 2 more often.
Skull and Crossbones. Vacplo is my ash. Skull and Crossbones. Arabe Tamal was killed by ITZ Real Player with 10.8 health. Skull and Crossbones. Necrotic Zombie 96 was killed by Shadow Master 2800 with 18.7 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Zombie Asher was killed by Flame Fighter 7 with 10.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Clip from 0. Skull and Crossbones. Lucas RGTPRO was Duels. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Mick Chalkberger Axe 2v2. Skull and Crossbones. Royal Zane 13 was killed by Xerxes Gotti with 20.0 health. Megafitter Yo Axe 2v2s. Skull and Crossbones. JH20 was killed by ZZIA with 18.8 health. ZZIAGG, Skull and Crossbones. Bell 7738 was killed by Mustjo 89 with 7.4 health. Mick Chalkberger Axe 2v2 1 more. Mustjo 89 GG, Skull and Crossbones. Flame Fighter 7 was killed by Gamer V Best 2012 with 4.8 health. JH20 You're So Bad, Skull and Crossbones. Twitch Ghosty was killed by Gutsy with 7.2 health. Skull and Crossbones. Woeful Aura 51045 was killed by ITZ Real Player with 5.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. TMYRR was killed by Bell 77386500. Skull and Crossbones. Gritchum's on Lord. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Killer check. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Triernald was killed by a place Thegam with 19.4 health. Skull and Crossbones. Herobrain 8551 died. Skull and Crossbones. Alternamy was killed by King Cobra Odd with 12.4 health. Skull and Crossbones. Zombie Asher was killed by Hulk Smashers with 4.8 health. Skull and Crossbones. Boys 9966 was killed by Mick Chalkberger with 11.6 health. Skull and Crossbones. Twitch Ghosty was killed by Soccer Boy 25 with Skull and Crossbones. Zombie Asher was killed.
Probably I shouldn't be too aggressive.
Skull and Crossbones. Gamer B. Skull and Crossbones. Iamphesman 1 was killed by JH20 with 20.0 health. Bedwarsking 24 stop running. Chasm and Shide spam. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Asian John 5499 was killed by Squ6n with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Electricum was killed by 51 Ahmed with 13.7 health. Skull and Crossbones. Bell 77386546 was killed by Boys 9966 with 12.3 health. Squ6n GG. Discord stay up to date with all announcements. Active GG. Blue Monkey Flies 9 Diamond Card. Skull and Dual. Skull and Crossbones. Donny 0822 was killed by ZZIA with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Thesipidurhoods was killed by Hyan with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Miner's Potato was killed by Normal with 14.1 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. LPMP 1646 was killed by Mr. Keystone with 12.6 health. Skull and Crossbones. Ferris Dunedin was killed by Tropicalized with 13.8 health. Skull and Crossbones. Shots Fire 4601 was killed by Epic Boy 8759 with 17.6 health. Skull and Crossbones. Annabelle Doll was killed by Not the Rye with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Nude 1,230. Skull and Crossbones. Notable Nude was killed by Lays Fishy with 8. Skull and Crossbones. Garu. Skull and Crossbones. Dual.
Rarely show up.
Rural Noodles. Red Heart. GG. Skull and Crossbones. Chicken Gamer 575 was killed by Orlandinho 19 with 19.2 health. Skull and Crossbones. Prince Rice 314 was killed by JH20 with 13.6 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Silenxper was killed by Arabe Tamal with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Luke PP5 was killed by Ikumi with 19.0 health. Orlandinho 19 GGD. Arla Fritz Nefsmp 10v10. Arla Fritz Nefsmp 10v10. Skull and Crossbones. Avora Bet was killed by Sigma Boy 12,345,798 with 20.0 health. ZZIA Nef SMP 3v3. Sigma Boy. XXZC1GGS. Skull and Crossbones. A place Thegam was killed by.
They need to add that.
Duels you.
offhand inventory bot.
Skull and Crossbones.
So,
Out base 36,634,211 was killed by Mistx with 20.0 health. Mistx says, Skull and Crossbones.
probably be,
Smale
could be seconds or even like
Skull and Crossbones. Bob Av was killed by Zombie Agent 13 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Garu Gamer 3241 was killed by Barry King Zavrave with 6.8 health. ZZINF SMP 10v10. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. High note 999,999 was killed by Kai Olaf with 12.3 health. Zombie Agent 13 GG. Asksquexao. Skull and Crossbones. Mahirachan 125 was killed by Musjo 89 with 4.8 health. Skull and Crossbones. EVC was killed by Xbeans with 19.9 health. Musjo 89 GG. Skull and Crossbones. Ferris Dunedin was killed by Tropicalized with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Axper 911 was killed by TMYRR with 10.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. Panther Boys was killed by Gupsy with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Barry King Zav. Draped Basal G. Duels. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Cash the Killer was killed by Chasm with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Natsa 2 was killed by Lil-3336 with 17.8 health. Skull and Crossbones. Batman the Cool was killed by Forgy with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Avora Bet was killed by JH20 with 20.0 health. 4DS, Skull and Crossbones. Max Bench 6307 was killed by Hamachop with 11.2 health. Musjo 89 Hey. Draped Basal Mace 1v1, Skull and Crossbones. Chicken Gamer 575 was killed by Dr. Decrypto with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Luca Dan 1804 was killed by Y Purple with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Sigmapuux was killed by RCGMK with 20.0. Slofsta GG. Gritchums Onlord GG. Skull and Crossbones. Clipfirmer 09. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Dirty Aperture 2 was killed by Head 5212 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Sigmapuux was killed by Mahirachan 125 with 2.0 health. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Information source. Tooltip. You can duel with your friends in all the same games publicly available. Use dual player fasted 15 more. Skull and Crossbones. Panther Boys was killed by Elinoga Murpro with 15.1 health. Arla Fritz 7 now. Skull and Crossbones. Adam Blaze 1. Skull and Crossbones. One Piece 1421. Megafitter Nefs 10.
That's my problem with
Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Sigmapuux was killed by Mahirachan 125 with 7.8 health. Megafitter yes. Skull and Crossbones. Frostsicle was killed by Everxis with 20.0 health. Frostsicle. SR. GG. Everxis GG. Skull and Crossbones. Notable Noob was killed by Fair with 12.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. Squid Plays was killed by Annabelle Dadal with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Jackmean 101010 was killed by Bents. Skull and Cross.
I just wish when
Skull and
the mouse is connected to
Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Cam Boogie was killed by Waffle 7658 with 15.8 health. Draped Basal GL. Skull and Crossbones. Oshenks died. Skull and Crossbones. Smail Mc1 was killed by RCGMK with 16.8 health. Zaddy Vibesnefsm 10v10. Skull and Crossbones. Ducky Clover was killed by Potato Craft 237 with 20.0 health. Zaddy Vibesnefsm 10v10. Potato Craft 237 GG. Zaddy Vibesv. Skull and Crossbones. Gajira Go. Skull and Crossbones. Adam Blaze 105 was killed by Kai Olaf with 20.0 health. King Elias joined Noshield 1v1. Zaddy Vibes. Skull and Crossbones. Zaddy Vibesnefsm 10v10. Skull and Crossbones. Epic Boy 8759 was killed by Rural Noodles with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Suhyok died. Skull and Crossbones. Medication was killed by Petting with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Panther Boys was killed by DFW Rapid with 20.0 health. Zaddy Vibesnefsm 10v10. Skull and Crossbones. Blockyboy 3001 was killed by Swung by Sky 425 with 15.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. Forgy GTG. Skull and Crossbones.
77. Oh.
Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Forgy Saya. Skull and Crossbones. Outbase 36,634,211 was killed by Nick Chopberger with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Lee 1 Ace was killed by Draped Basal with 14.7 health. Skull and Crossbones. Shad Thashak was killed by G7 Solars with 20.0 health. Draped Basal GGS. Zaddy Vibesnefsm 10v10. Nick Chopberger GG. Zaddy Vibesnefsm 10v10. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Tropicalized was killed by Scripts GFG.
I actually did the momentum
Duels you
better than I would want.
Skull and Crossbones. Zombie Asher was killed by Soccer.
Not running when I was
Hence GG. Skull and Crossbones. Clipfirmer 098 was killed by Kwang Kai with 20.0 health. Blaze Mage YTGG. Skull and Crossbones. Germbo Bands was killed by Swung by Sky 425 with 3.0 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. ZZIA that damn tree hollow gaming 26. Skull and Crossbones. SLMD was killed by GJ 4661 with 15.6 health. Skull and Crossbones. Megafitter was killed by Smii with 20.0 health. Zaddy Vibesnefsm 10v10. Germbo Bands cheat. Skull and Crossbones. Luca Dan 1804 was killed by Kai Olaf with 6. Skull and Crossbone. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Tedawedix 2 was killed.
Slow your speed down.
Skull and Crossbones. Spira 1 Blade was killed by Electricum with 8.4 health. Zaddy Vibesnefsm 10v10. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Ryderthagoat 656 was killed by Trierenald with 17.2 health. Skull and Crossbones. Few Guitar 808,543 was killed by GJ 4661 with 17.4 health. Skull and Crossbones. Mahirachan 125 was killed by Osamegu I 6999 with 1.2 health. Gajira Go Yo, is there a way to report PPL on here? Zaddy Vibes.
But anyways, that was
Skull and Crossbones. Gupsy was killed by Bossniggle with 12.6 health. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Outbase 36,634,211 was killed by Bobcat Leader with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Blockyboy 3001 was killed by Soccer Boy 25 with 16.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Simplesmac was killed by Arabe Tamal with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Epic Boy 8759 was killed by Y Purple with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. TMYRR was killed by Totem 816 with 8.2 health. Skull and Crossbones.
Okay.
SMEIZIIGG. Electrosix 0 Diaput 1v1. Skull and Crossbones.
Y'all saw
Evan
that?
10222 was killed by Soccer Boy 25 with 16.4 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Asamegui 6999 was killed by Mahirachan 125 with 7.4 health. Genera El Mace Wind Lag. Skull and Crossbones. One Piece 1421 was killed by Skull and Crossbones. King Bob 8900. It's Dimush UHC2. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Picklefish was killed by SMEIZII with 20.0 health.
Also,
Skull and Crossbones.
What does king mean?
Skull and Crossbones.
But I know
GJ 4661 was killed by Sasimp 67 with 17.2 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. SL1CKZ 4589 Lifesteal 2v2. Skull and Crossbones. Hamachop was killed by Chupa Non-Stop with 17.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. AO Alred Rage was killed by Y Purple with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Petting was killed by SH1 8273 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Bob the Bob 1011 was Skull and Crossbones. Strong Muffin 818 was
is the key for the shield.
Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. One Piece 1421 was killed by 5128 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Clipfirmer 098 was killed by Sufila with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Frog Punch 20 was killed by Soccer Boy 25 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Fire Diamond 500.
At first, my first
Skull and Crossbones. Null Zero was killed by Lace Fishy with 0.0 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Y Purple Neth 5v5 join. Not ITZ Real Me. GG. Y Purple 5v5 Neth. Skull and Crossbones. Notable Noob was killed by Fair with 18.7 health. Y Purple 5v5 Neth. Skull and Crossbones. Weakness 11 was killed by Outbase 36,634,211 with 20.0 health. Afanis Ghoul 21 at SL1CKZ 4589 Lifesteal 1v1. Skull and Crossbones. Bun 7 was killed by Speed Sil.
Basically, I'm gonna 1v1 him.
Bents GG.
And that's part of why I am training.
Skull and Crossbones. Zerixnopex was killed by Gabetagoat 123 with 3.8 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. A Cheeto was killed by MR Scrum YT with 17.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Blue Flame 309 was killed by WW Womp X2 with 14.1 health. Jmilvrux Faza Gaming Redstone 2v2. Skull and Crossbones. Bobcat Leader was killed by Draped Basal with 18.9 health. Skull and Crossbones. Clipfirmer 098 was killed by Literally 2850 with 20.0 health. Draped Basal GGS. Skull and Crossbones. Asamegui 6999 was killed by Embryasbad with 8.7 health. Skull and Skull and Crossbones. Electricum was killed by Spira 1 Blade with 20.0 health. JC110 V10. Skull and Crossbones. Oni 10,101,010 was killed by Bossniggle with 8.9 health. Skull and Crossbones. Joji 3919 died. Skull and Crossbones. Dark Crystal 75 was killed by Pegunico with 11.6 health. Almided 0 GGG. Skull and Crossbones. East Impala 62040 was killed by Sepuhus with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Chilgui 789986. Skull and Crossbones. Hax 132 was killed by Bloodlizens with 17.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Yazine 125 was killed by M1KRXW with 20.0 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and crossbones. Zerix Nopex was killed by trademark Toby with 4.3 health. Electrazix 010 V10 Nefs 2 more. Draped Basalmi. Clown Pearsall. Number 1. Ixbeanstir, Skull and Crossbones. Almided 0G was killed by Dustystone 20,640 with 20.0 health. Almided 0GGG, Skull and Crossbones. Sigma Boy 68,640 was killed by Bowls 14 with 15.2 health. Skull and Crossbones. Angel Rico was killed by Soccer Boy 25 with 5.0 health. Xbeans. Cyrillic letter Ha. Im unranked. Discord stay up to date with all announcements.
And just like suspected, I disconnected from the server. Alright. Technoblade would probably be like, yeah, he actually would. If he got disconnected like that, he'd probably be like, or probably be like,
Welcome. Sharkboy 2637 to Flame Frags. Airplane.
Is that lag really that too much to handle? You know what I mean. It would probably be like that, or just plain old like.
Welcome. Sharkboy 2637 to Flame. Skull and Crossbones. Mando Force 5556 was killed by player 386,628,767 with 15.8. Skull and Crossbones. Mustjo 89 was killed by Shadow Master 2800 with 20.0. King Elias GG. Bacchulus. Skull and Crossbones. Gold Voltage died. Skull and Crossbones. Sneerups was killed by Soccer Boy 25 with 20.0 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. King Printham was killed by Alexander Larson 5 with 20.0 health. Marcus the Goat 12S. Skull and Crossbones. TwixJI was killed by Bloodlizins with 7.9 health. Skull and Crossbones. SL1CKZ 4589 was killed by Drive A Bus with 18.7 health. Skull and Crossbones. Arla Fritz was killed by Hollow Gaming 26 with 11.0 health. Alexander Larson 5 GG. Skull and Crossbones. Skycake LD was killed by Almided 0G with 20.0 health. Almided 0G GG. Arla Fritz GGS. Skull and Crossbones. Batman the Cool was killed by Clown Pearsall with 20.0 health. Nerdout Thenner 2S. Smee I love QDS. Fasted GG. Mustjo 89 Hey. D. Skull and Crossbones. Shadowx was killed by Pressure with 20.0 health. Zaddy Vibes Nefs 10v10. Skull and Crossbones. Masantha Goat 1 was killed by Bucks with 3.5 health. Skull and Crossbones. XTX000 was killed by Rural Noodles with 20.0 health. Zaddy Vibes Nefs 10v10. Skull and Crossbones. Everxis was killed by Axel FR with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Elijah 8974 was killed by BJ Quashir with 20.0 health. Zaddy Vibes Nefs 10v10. Skull and Crossbones. Clipfirmer 098 was killed by King Elias with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Elsrat 73,442,646 was killed by Sasimp 67 with 10.5 health. King Elias G. Zaddy Vibes Nefs 10v10. Skull.
I'm improving a lot. Like I stopped using.
Skies are easy. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skies are easy. Zaddy Vibes Nefs 10v10. Skull and Crossbones. Panther Boys was killed by Koninayu with 14.5 health. Skull and Crossbones. JC1 was killed by Q10 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Exotics was killed by Plumpy Monkey with 18.9 health. Genera El Mace Win 10v10 Neth SMP2 Mo. Skull and Crossbones. Dominator 291,997 was killed by Blue Cat 112,200. BJ Quashir Mace 2v2Q. Skull and Crossbones. SL1CKZ 4589 was killed by Fazdad with Gajira Go GG.
Alright, I don't know.
Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Dominator 291,997 was killed by Frog Punch 2-0 with 14.6 health. BJ Quashir Mace 2v2q2 more. BJ Quashir Mace 2v2q2 more. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Blockyboy 3001 was killed by Twisted Wolf 8853 with 14.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. Luca Dan 1804 was killed by Rated Baker 72 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Abdel 30 was killed by Zerixnopex with 3.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. AO Rage was killed by Q10 with 12.9 health. Skull and Crossbones. Alexander Lerson 5 was killed by Rocket Atom with 12.2 health. Skull and Crossbones. Hikaos 1592 was killed by Pego Nico with 20.0 health. BJ Quashir Mace 2v2q2 more. Skull and Crossbones. Panterboys was killed by Koninayu with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Zrock was killed by Exotics with 6.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Snippergirl 20711 was killed by Skyzer with 18.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Apski died. Skull and Crossbones. Jaji 3919 was killed by F6BBZ with 13.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Chilguai 789987 was killed by Kingbob 2727 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. TMYRR was killed by Tanmzua with 6.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Araza 2 File was killed by King Elias with 8.1 health. King Elias GG. Skull and Crossbones. Masanthagoat 1 was killed by Bucks with 4.2 health. Skull and Crossbones. Uday Recreation was killed by Bloodlizins with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Quiet Chalk 45096 was killed by LD Note Zesty with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Uday Recreation GG. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and
If I were to duel Dream, then
Duels
duel and Techno.
Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Panterboys was killed by Tanmzua with 18.5 health. Skull and Crossbones. Santimesi 191 was killed by Thwasty with 20.0 health. Thwasty S. Skull and Crossbones. Dingleberry 14 was killed by Marcus the Goat 12 with 16.5 health. Skull and Crossbones. Luca Dan 1804 was killed by its God Mode with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Wuality was killed by Soccer Kid 912 with 8.5 health. Skull and Crossbones. Julius Twyat was killed by Totem 816 with 11.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. Philjava was killed by TMYRR with 11.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. Blue Cat 112,200.
Combat log?
Skull and Crossbones. Blue Cat 112,213 was killed by Embryus Bad with 14.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Flame Fighter 7 was killed by RCGMK with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Luca Dan 1804 was killed by its God Mode with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. MA1 was killed by Axel FR with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Glitched official join. Skull. Iguana Big Cake GG. Duels U. Skull and Crossbones. Gajira Go was killed by Saram with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Hikaos 1592 was killed by Cat.
More losses than
Skull and Crossbones. Bob the Bob 1011 was killed by ITZ0 Mar with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Sasimp 67 was killed by Maxes with 11.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. Forgy was killed by Findermich with 20.0 health. Glitched official join 2 vs 2 maze. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Maxes EZ. Skull and Crossbones. Bents was killed by Laughable with 4.3 health. Laughable GG. Skull and Crossbones. Batman the Cool was killed by G. Skull and MMMYT 600.
Minecraft's former player,
Skull and Crossbones. NKI Zephyr 7 was killed by Asom with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Happy Manzak was killed by Apski with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Lugu 2222 was killed by RHVMMKGVGB with 20.0 health. Anubis 96 where TF is this blue kid? Skull and Crossbones. XTX000 was killed by BJ Quashir with 20.0 health. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Flame Fighter 7 was killed by its God mode with 17.9 health. Skull and Crossbones. MXSTRRS was killed by Axel FR with 10.9 health. Skull and Crossbones. TMYRR was killed.
Nice one.
Drapedbasal Skull and Crossbones. Lucas 23XX7. Skull and Crossbones. Near Hacks 132. Skyzer Jump. Skull and Crossbones. Glitched Official was killed by Goopvergd. Skyzer Get a Job Puss. Skull and Crossbones. King Printham was killed by 4Key with 20.0 health. ITZ Adila S Hacker. Outbase 36,634,211 GG. Skull and Crossbones. MXSTRRS was killed by Crazy Dragon Vins with 19.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. LD Notes SD was killed.
Okay, there we go.
Skull and Crossbones. Lilash 4171 was killed by .getCL1 page 3D 6581 with 17.9 health. Skull and Crossbones. Zerixnopex was killed by Asom with 18.5 health. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. It's God mode TF. Skull and Crossbones. Drive A bus was killed by Big Chunk. Skull and Crossbones. JC11 was killed by Dino 7380 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Rhoda 1. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. King Elias was
Maybe I need to jump.
Skull and Crossbones. Snippergirl 20711 was killed by its real subs with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. School 21 was killed by Clipfirmer 098 with 8.2 health. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. RCGMK Diamond Cart 1v1. Skull and Crossbones. Mikacool 1,173,973 was killed by Gojira Go with 10.9 health. Megafitter Nets 10v10 6 more. Gojira Go GG. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Lyric Egg 00490. Skull and Duels. Skull and Crossbones. Slay 7826 was killed by mistaken IFAs with 20.0 health. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Rocket Adam was killed by Blood Lizards with 20.0 health. Soccer Boy 25 one more person Crystal 2v2. MXSTRRS Crystal 2v2. Skull and Crossbones. Krasiflin 777 was killed by Sneerups with 18.6 health. Skull and Crossbones. Elijah. Skull and Crossbones. Outbase 36 million. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. BJ. The Real Arsenal GG. Skull and Crossbones. Axel FR was killed by Clown Pearsall with 13.4 health. Skull and Crossbones. Rural Noodles was killed by Skull and Crossbones. Totem 816 was killed by Udak Befis with 12 points. Skull and Crossbones. Rhoda 1 was killed by TMYRR with 5.1 health. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave. Skull and Crossbones. Raging Inferno GG was killed by Q10 with 20.0 health. Web store. Make purchases and help support the server. Purchase a rank, cosmetics or coins and more at our store. Storeflamafrags.com. Skull and Crossbones. Vexcrafts was killed by Prometheus with 18.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Player 386,628,767 was killed by Clown Pearsall with 20 points. Skull and Crossbones. Crazy Dragon Vince was killed by No 2015. Soccer Boy Gojira Goji. Dual. Skull and Crossbones. Obey 87 was killed by Saram with 20. Stezifneth SMP5. Skull and Crossbones. Radovan 3000 was killed by Axel Fair with 20.0 health. Asom Stop Shield Spamming Holy. Skull and Crossbones. MMM1 Le was killed by .itz Not Billy 6789 with 19.5 health. Axel Fair GG. Skull and Crossbones. Leucocitor was killed by Velxify with 15.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. Imminent Destroy was killed by Notarhu with. Soccer Boy 25 join Crystal 2v2 join. Tabs 1 OMG. Soccer Boy 25 join Crystal 2v2. Stezifneth SMP5. MXSTR. Duo. Endermite 168,580 GG. MXSTRRS Crystal 2v2. Stezifneth SMP5 VB5. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Stezifneth SMP5 V5. Skull and Crossbones. I-25,874 was killed by Crazy Dragon Bins with 12.3 health. Skyzer reports Asiboy Auto Crystal and Hacking. Stezifneth SMP5 BV5. ZZIANeth SMP5 V5. Skyzer Hope You Jump. Skull and Crossbones. Caxtile was killed by only Juance with 5.1 health. Soccer Boy 25Q Crystal 2v2 now. Skull and Crossbones. Gregor 90 was killed by TMYRR with 15.5 health. Stezifneth SMP5 V5. Skull and Crossbones. TwixJI was killed by Bumma's clan with 10.8 health. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Thesipidurhids was killed by ZZIA with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Tabs 1 OMG.
I also need to work on like shooting the
Skull and Crossbones.
as fat as
Skull and Crossbones. Amazingat 527,654 was killed by Learulas 312 with 18.8 health. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. Kraziflin 777 was killed by Crazy Dragon Vins with 12.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Wazus was killed by King Bob 8901 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Elsrat 73,442,646 died. Skull and Crossbones. I-25,874 was killed by Sneerups with 6.3 health. Clips S. Discord. Stay up to date with all announcements, giveaways, events and much more. Join the Flame Frags community Discord today. Discord GG Flamafrags. Skull and Crossbones. Vortex IMC was killed by Laughable with 9.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Lil. Skull and Crossbones. Pickopt was killed by Hacks 132 with 15.4 health. Skull and Crossbones. TM. Skull and Crossbones.
Two more matches because my phone is gonna run out of battery.
Bloodless. Skull and Crossbones. X2 Turiah was killed by Luke Erid 175 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. CR8 Zych was killed by WAV6 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Gregor 90 was killed by Grumpy Banana 1 with 4.4 health. Skull and Crossbones. Its God Mode was killed. Skull and Crossbones. Tearing Wave 4007 was killed by Axis 2856 with 20.0 health. DFW Rapid GG. Information source. Notice, you can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. ITZ Attila Actual Trash Server. Skull and Crossbones. I-25,874 was killed by Crazy Dragon Vins with 3.7 health. Skull and Crossbones. AMC 616007 was killed by Ariza 2 file with 17.6 health. Phantom Flare bro what? Skull and Crossbones. Levigleni was killed by Ace of Spadaltx with 20. Duels. Skull and Crossbones. Else Rat 73,442,646 was killed by Clips with 17.0 health. 9100 Diacart 1v1. Clips GG. Skull.
Actually, just one victory.
Skull and Crossbones. Squigglebop 7 was killed by XX Void Spectrum XX with 4.2 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Soccer Boy 25 joined 2v2 Mace Q. Skull and Crossbones. TMYRR was killed by Sapphira 7 Sins with 6.8 health. Skull and Crossbones. Anubis 96 was killed by Robba Dr. John with 16.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Abdel 30 was killed by Zerix Nopex with 9.4 health. Skull and Crossbones. 6 Sleepy was killed by Sasimp 67 with 2.3 health. Stezifneth SMP 2v2. Sapphira 7 Sins. SR. GG. Skull and Crossbones. Cullen 52517 was killed by Clonepier 6456 with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Totem 816 was killed by Gregor 90 with 9.9 health. Stezifneth SMP 2v2. Skull and Crossbones. Manny Ombre died. Skull and Crossbones. Marlowe Sword. Duels you. Skull and Crossbones. Bumma's clan was killed by Rhoda 1 with 14.7 health. Skull and Crossbones. Gojirago was killed by Flying Tiger 7495 with 20.0 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Skull and Crossbones. It's Gold II was killed by L0GS with 0.1 health. Skull and Crossbones. Scully 902 was killed by Robba Dr. John with 20.0 health. Gojira Go GG. Skull and Crossbones. Pixelblade 101 was killed by Kwang Kai with 20.0 health. Skull and Crossbones. Stezif was killed by Exalt 4KQ Lifesteal 1v1. Skull and Crossbones. TMYRR was killed by Gregor 90 with 18.2 health. Skull and Crossbones. Rip Viper was killed by Saram with 20.0 health. Soccer Boy 25 bro get off my team. Skull and Crossbones. Wazus was killed by King Bob 8901 with 7.2 health. Skull and Crossbones. Epic Gamer. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. Skull and Crossbones. DFW Rapid was killed by Darolmuk with 17.8 health. Skull and Crossbones. MMMYT 666 was killed by Bossniggle with 20.0 health. Darolmuk GG. Scully 902 yo. Blood Lizards. $sign.
Because obviously I don't have
Skull and Crossbones. Stezif was killed by Diego Avila 12354 with 17.8 health. Skull and Crossbones. L0GS was killed by Scully 902 with 17.6 health. Information source. Notice. You can use spawn to leave the game. Statistics will be counted in 5 seconds. Scully 902 GG. Skull and Crossbones. Sasimp 67 was killed by Captain Emil with 11.7 health. Skull and Crossbones. Dingleberry 14 was killed by Exalt 4K with 20.0 health. Captain Emil GGS. Marlowe Swordfx good boy. Skull and Crossbones. X3 Aware was killed by 21 Spec with 19.4 health. Information source. Tooltip. You can duel with your friends in all the same games publicly available.
That was too close as well.
Clips S. Skull and Crossbones. Darolmuk was killed by Xfabs with 20.0 health. Darolmuk GG. Skull and Crossbones. Jin was killed by Kid AJ Gaming with 12.3 health. Skull and Crossbones. The Phoenix 1424 was killed by Sega Crazy 7414 with 20.0 health. Skull